Good morning, and can I welcome everyone to the 11th meeting of the Education and Skills Committee in 2021. Can I please remind everyone to turn mobile devices off or to silent for the duration of the meeting. This is the final meeting of the Education and Skills in this session of the Parliament, and we have received apologies from Alec Neil, MSP. Agenda item 1, the first item is to decide whether to take agenda item 5 in private. Does everyone agree? The next item on the agenda is to consider the following negative instrument: Looked After Children Scotland Amendment Regulations 2021, SSI 2021/103. Details of the instruments are in the paper. Do members have any comments on the instrument? Well, I see no comments there. I'll move on to the next agenda item. The committee will consider the draft annual report for the parliamentary year from the 12th of May 2020 to the 25th of March 2021, our legacy paper. This summarises our work since the committee was formed in 2016 and was published on Monday. Do members have any comments on the annual report? Not seeing any indication of that. Can I just thank the clerks for their works in their help in drafting the annual report. Agenda item 4 is coronavirus and education. We are in a strict time limit for this, and I would remind members we want to be clear of this agenda item before 12 o'clock today. It's a main evidence session focusing on coronavirus and education. And can I welcome to the committee for the final time this session, John Swinney, MSP Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills in the Scottish Government. And can I invite Mr Swinney to make an opening statement?
Good morning, Kavira, and thank you for the opportunity to take part in the committee's proceedings this morning, and as you indicated, for the final time in this parliamentary session. Kavira, I know that I speak for many of us who as parents were delighted to see our children able to return to school in recent weeks. For children, seeing their teachers and friends again offers a degree of routine and familiarity. For older pupils in secondary schools, for whom things are not quite back to normal yet, even returning to school for short periods of time each week allows them to reconnect with their peers. As the final element of the phased return, it remains our intention that all pupils will return to full-time in-school learning after the Easter break. The Advisory Subgroup on Education and Children's Issues met again yesterday and stressed the importance of strengthening other mitigations such as ventilation and outdoor learning as part of relaxing the strict 2-metre physical distancing requirements between pupils in secondary schools. We will publish associated guidance to enable school staff to prepare accordingly. In addition, we will need to continue to carefully monitor the data over the coming weeks, including learning from the experience in England. At present, however, we know that the proportion of primary school and early learning and childcare settings with incidents remains low. Where outbreaks have occurred, these are predominantly higher case rates in the local community. I also take considerable reassurance from our enhanced asymptomatic testing programme, which will be further expanded to include S1 to 3 pupils after the Easter break. Take-up of that testing offer has been encouraging. In the week ending the 7th of March, more than 56,000 staff and 12,000 pupils took tests. The number of positive asymptomatic cases identified has also been low. Since the programme began 5 weeks ago, 0.1% of cases have been positive after confirmatory PCR testing. This programme is helping to break chains of transmission as early as possible, and I would encourage all those who are eligible to make use of the offer to do so when they return to school. Despite this progress, I do not underestimate the extent to which children and young people have experienced disruption to their daily lives as a result of the pandemic, nor to the physical and mental health impacts of lockdown. Further, we know from our own work, including January's equity audit, that those impacts may have fallen unequally across society. Therefore, I am pleased to tell the committee that we intend to provide an enhanced range of summer activities for children and young people in order to address the impacts associated with extended periods of isolation and reduced participation in normal activities. This offer will have children's rights and needs at its heart, and will seek to provide opportunities to connect and socialise while accessing a range of activities combined with broader supports where needed. This will build on local offers already in progress, recognising the need for flexibility to deliver using local assets and connecting with wider offers from partners such as Sports Scotland and Creative Scotland. In addition, I'm delighted to announce £19.4 million of Scottish Government funding to support a 6-year mentoring programme by MCR Pathways to help young people reach their full potential. This programme will be delivered in partnership with local authorities that wish to participate and will be part of the Scottish Government's Young Persons Guarantee to provide long-term support where it is needed most. We will work closely with our colleagues in local government to shape the detail of these programmes. Those investments are in addition to almost £400 million of funding we have committed to already for education recovery during this year and next. Over the next few months, we will continue to develop further all aspects of our education recovery strategy with our partners and stakeholders. In parallel, through the National Qualifications 2021 group, key partners have collaborated to ensure that the hard work of learners is recognised and allows them to achieve the qualifications they need to proceed to the next stage of their education or enter employment. The alternative certification model developed aims to strike the right balance between teacher judgment and ensuring that processes are in place locally and nationally to help ensure fairness and consistency. To aid this, I have asked Her Majesty's Inspectors of Education to undertake a review of local authority approaches to quality assurance activity. However, I want to be clear that the review will not add to the workload and pressure on schools. The focus will be on local authority quality assurance activity, a key aspect of this year's approach to awarding national qualifications. This review, combined with SQA processes, will support confidence in ensuring that learners across the country get the grades that they deserve. Just as the approach to certification has been co-produced, there is also a role for all parts of the system to work together to ensure that it delivers for our young people. I'm confident that everyone will work together to achieve this most important of outcomes. Finally, I would like to express my sincere thanks to Scotland's children, parents and families, teachers, school leaders and support staff for everything they have done during this past year. I'm also very grateful for all the support provided to ensure that our children and young people continue to make progress in their learning and development. And I look forward to answering the committee's questions this morning.
Thank you very much, Mr Swinney. I am going to move to questions from the committee. Can I remind everyone, if they wish to ask a question, could they put an R in the chat function? And I'll go to Mr Green for the first question.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary, and I apologise in advance for not staying to the end of the committee session this morning. I just want to open with the back to school plans, Cabinet Secretary. I want to ask specifically if the government intends to change its advice or requirements around social distancing on the school estate. And the reason for that clearly is that at 2 metres social distancing, especially in the classroom environment, it is virtually impossible to get all students back to school. Now, you've just made a commitment to get all young people back into school after the Easter holidays, which is very welcome. But of course, the anecdotal feedback that we've had in the last few weeks is that those who have returned to school prior to Easter have not always been engaged in traditional classroom learning and have been getting a somewhat school experience due to the social distancing needs. Of course, not all schools can accommodate all pupils without social distancing. So I wondered if the government had a position on that and can give some clarification and indeed confirmation that back to school means back to school and back into the classroom.
Mr Swinney?
Thank you, Convener. The fundamental point that I think Mr Green is looking for me to confirm is that a return to full-time face-to-face schooling in the secondary sector would require for pupils the removal of the 2 metre physical distancing requirement and in a classroom setting. And that is the assumption on which a full-time return to school is based. Now, there will, in all likelihood, be a requirement for there to remain the necessity for physical distancing between adults within schools and between adults and pupils within schools. There will be the need for a whole variety of other mitigation measures to be in place, but fundamentally to enable a full-time return to face-to-face schooling in the secondary sector, that 2 metre physical distancing requirement would have to be relaxed. Now, the Education Advisory Subgroup has looked at all of these questions, and essentially they will have to, as will the Education Recovery Group, monitor the data about the prevalence of the virus to determine if that is a safe assumption for us to operate on when it comes to the moment of return to schooling. Now, the committee will appreciate that still remains a few weeks away. The first return to school after the Easter holidays is the 12th of April in about 5 or 6 authorities, with the remainder on the 19th of April. So there is there's a bit of time to elapse before we can be definitive. And as we know with the virus, it can accelerate in its spread. We hope that will be the case. There's obviously a wide variety of societal mitigation factors, not least of which is the extensive prevalence of the vaccination programme. But fundamentally, the assumption about a full-time return to face-to-face schooling in the secondary sector will be predicated on a relaxation of that 2 metre physical distancing rule for pupils within the school estate within a classroom setting, but there will be the likelihood that we will require pupils to observe some other constraints in moving around schools and other mitigating factors.
Thank you for that, I understand, and that sounds like a yes, I think, in amongst there. Can I just push you perhaps before I ask my other question, and that's around something you said just towards the tail end of your last answer, and that's that if the advisors say that conditions do not merit a full return to school, that decision that you've made a commitment to yet may change. In other words, I think a lot of parents are under the assumption that their children will be going back to school full time after Easter, come what may. But it sounds to me like there's still an element of doubt, perhaps there, understandably, given the as you say, the ever-changing virus situation. But if that be the case, then when will the final decision be made so that those parents can obviously plan around that, particularly when it comes to childcare and work arrangements?
Certainly, in relation to the primary sector, there is, I'm proceeding on the assumption, I'm not even sure assumption is the right word, the foundation that we have returned the primary sector and the early learning centre settings, and we are now back in that mode of operation on an ongoing basis. So the only circumstances in which arrangements around primary education or early learning and childcare would change was if we had a wider virus problem of the type that we had to respond to in January, which I sincerely hope is not the case, and I don't expect to be the case because of the low comparative levels of the virus. When it comes to the secondary sector, we are proceeding with a certain amount of uncertainty, and I can only express it that way to the committee this morning, that we will want to take decisions at the earliest possible opportunity to give confirmation and certainty to families and to schools, to give as much notice as possible. But I hope the committee will understand that I have to inject a certain amount of caution about being able to definitively say what will be the position, because I have to monitor the data and the information that prevails over the course of the next 2 to 3 weeks. But I give the committee the assurance that we will give the earliest possible clarification and confirmation of the arrangements that we possibly can do.
I understand, and I'm sorry to push this. It wasn't my intended line of questioning, but just your answer has expanded on it. And so you say that you're going to wait another 2 to 3 weeks before making a final decision. So that takes us to the middle of April, which is just about at the end of Easter holidays for some. So, I mean, how much notice will parents be given? A few days, a week, fortnight?
The subgroup from whom I take a great deal of advice on these questions will meet again on the 6th of April. So I wouldn't want Mr Green to leave the conversation thinking this is a middle of April decision. This is a very early April advice and guidance that will come to ministers. And obviously, if we receive confirmation on the 6th of April, when they will be in a position to look, the subgroup will be in a position to look at a lot of the data that has emerged from the experience in England, that will give us much more of an insight into the circumstances that are likely to prevail and how we might take decisions accordingly. So I think I would say to Mr Green that a decision in the aftermath of the 6th of April, that our central planning assumption of a return to full-time in-school face-to-face learning after the Easter holidays is going to prevail, is the timescale for such confirmation.
Thank you for that. That's very helpful. Convener, if it's okay, I'll maybe just ask one substantial question and then leave it to others to pick up.
Thanks, Mr Green, but I've got a number of members in. If there's time at the end, I will bring you back in, but I'll move on for now if you don't mind. So I can bring in Mr Johnson.
Thank you very much, Convener. And in a sense, my questions follow on from Jamie Green's. And if Jamie is asking about the coming term, I think what I'm interested in is actually the medium to longer term. But for very good reasons, the whole of the private and public sectors have been working on a kind of week-to-week, month-to-month basis. What we'd hope is that with the vaccination programme completing through the summer, we'll be able to move towards a position where medium-term planning is possible. Can I just ask what work is being undertaken by the government to look at what the implications of a fully rolled out vaccine will be in terms of planning for the education sector as a whole, whether that's requirements around social distancing, infection control, because obviously this is a time of year where the next school year would normally be planned, but at the moment a lot of those assumptions and underpinnings of what will be possible are not clear. So could I ask us what that medium-term plan is for the coming academic year and beyond in terms of a steady state once we have the vaccine rolled out?
I think in answering Mr Johnston's question, I think I would probably go back to the position that prevailed in August of last year. And between August of last year and December of last year, by and large, we managed to sustain normal face-to-face provision of schooling within Scotland in all sectors. Now, I appreciate in amongst that, there were classes that were self-isolating, there were cohorts that had to self-isolate. But fundamentally, for the overwhelming majority of pupils in Scotland, the normal arrangements prevailed between August and December. Now, obviously, in that period, we did not have any real presence of the vaccination programme. The vaccination programme only began to really motor in January of 2021. So I hope that would reassure Mr Johnston that my fundamental planning assumption is that for the start of really from the end of the Easter holidays, actually, we would return to the delivery of face-to-face schooling in a fashion that we would all recognise. And that will be the assumption for the period going forward. Now, in amongst that, there will undoubtedly have to be mitigation measures in place. There'll have to be arrangements to take into account the necessity for greater hand hygiene arrangements. In movement around schools, I think there will be requirements for physical distancing. There may well be requirements for physical distancing to continue to be observed between adults within schools. But fundamentally, I would be optimistic that the core educational offer that we make available to young people in Scotland would be able to prevail after the conclusion of the Easter holidays, and my assumption would be that would be the operating basis for the period beyond that.
Thank you for that answer, and that gives us a sense of the broad outlook. Obviously, that would need to be underpinned by guidance and presumably a broader set of strategies, both around dealing with the new context, infection control and so on, but also in terms of educational recovery, identifying gaps and so on. So is the government planning to issue guidance for the new school year? Is it going to be producing a strategy for essentially educational catch-up? And if so, when will we see those things?
I think I'm glad that Mr. Johnson has raised this issue, and I'm also glad that he's used the terminology that he's used of catch-up, because it allows me to air this issue, because I think this is an issue that we have to open up and explore, because I think we've got to, and Mr. Johnson knows that I'm engaging constructively on this question because it is a substantial issue. I have to say I'm nervous about the concept of education catch-up, because I listen to teachers who tell me that, and I participated in a call just on, well, 2 calls over the last 2 weeks with probably about over 1,000 teachers actually, facilitated by Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Education. And I would say that there was a lot of feedback on those calls about the fact that despite the fact there's been disruption to learning, young people have actually learnt a great deal during the process of disruption. I think we have to be careful about the language we use here, about what has happened to young people. Teachers were offering in that call to me a lot of evidence about the fact that the resilience of young people has been greatly strengthened by what they have had to adapt to as a consequence of lockdown. And they have essentially undertaken extensive learning as a consequence of all of that. Now, that is not in any way to say that there isn't a necessity to focus individually on how we support the learning of young people to make sure they're able to have accomplished the type of learning outcomes that we would expect them to achieve on an ongoing basis. But I think that's quite a different concept from the notion of, if I can use the words in Mr. Johnson's question, and they're words that are used extensively in the media debate, of catch-up. I think young people have actually been learning a lot during lockdown. They've been learning a lot through remote learning led by their educators, but they've learned a lot out with that formal education. And I think we should recognise that there are benefits and advantages in all of that. But crucially, we have to focus on the needs of individual young people in supporting their learning outcomes. Now, Mr. Johnson also raised in his question the issue about a wider strategy on these questions. And that will be the product of discussion within the Education Recovery Group. Indeed, we had a very substantive discussion about this just last week, and we will have further discussions about this, because this has to be a system-wide conversation where we formulate the views amongst professional staff, the professional associations, local authorities, directors of education, working with the government and our agencies to make sure we put in place the strategic guidance that enables such an approach to prevail.
Thank you. And I just ask one final question before I do.
Mr. Johnson, are you moving on to?
It's about the consequences for the coming academic year.
Very briefly, but I'm very conscious that if it's in the same area, yes, please. But if not, I will bring you in at the end once other members have had a chance to come in.
Well, just critically, I mean, I do think there does need to be guidance for the coming academic year. That also needs to take account that there is, at the very least, a risk of new variants that essentially supersede or essentially overcome the protections of the virus. are those contingencies being drawn up? And essentially, will they be there and transparent so we essentially know what plan A is, but we also know what plan B is if new variants emerge in the population?
I think it's obviously we are, my health colleagues and the government more widely are looking very closely at all of the information about possible new variants, and obviously it's very material to the control of the pandemic. And that information has been monitored very closely. I hope the committee would take some reassurance from the very vigorous way in which our public health authorities have pursued examples of the Brazilian variant, for example, where it has presented itself in Scotland. The public health response has been absolutely targeted and focused to avoid further spread of variants with which we are either unfamiliar or about which we are uncertain about whether uncertain about our knowledge about those particular variants. So in a public health sense, we will be pursuing that approach very vigorously. What Mr Johnson's question raises, however, is a question about contingency planning around the delivery of education should we face a more acute clinical situation. And I think what I would reassure the committee about is that the work that's been undertaken in the delivery of remote learning, I think by the judgments of Her Majesty's Inspectors of Education, and I think by some of the wider debate, has been viewed to be a very strong proposition that's been available. I want to strengthen that further through the National e-learning offer to make sure that there is ever more provision in place to support remote learning should we be in a position where we have to rely on that as a contingency on an ongoing basis. But obviously my fundamental plan is to get young people back into face-to-face learning at the earliest possible opportunity, and I expect that to be after the Easter holidays and to sustain that thereafter. But if there was a need to deploy a contingency, then it is likely to be a reliance on the remote learning model that we have put in place, and if that can be operated alongside some in-school provision, which is also what we've operated since January, then that would be the approach that the government would take with our partners.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I bring Mr Greer in, please?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. To follow this line of questioning around what the kind of near future looks like, the term from August onwards, out with a very small number of children and young people in very specific circumstances, most under 16s are not going to receive the vaccine anytime soon. Given that, is the intention to continue operating the offer of asymptomatic testing for senior school pupils? Is the intention to continue operating that from August into the new term?
That would be my expectation. Yes, I think this is. I think actually this has been a. I think this has been a really welcomed. I know Mr Greer has pursued this issue vigorously, and I think it's been a really welcome development and a welcome level of participation by senior pupils and staff. The levels of participation have been really quite extraordinary, to be honest, and I'm optimistic that that will be carried on with S1 to S3 pupils when it's rolled out after the Easter holidays.
That's excellent to hear, and I thank the government for introducing it. Are those numbers available? Just this is not my main line of questioning, but the numbers on participation available, even if you've not got them to hand at the moment, if they could be circulated, that would be very interesting.
I am now looking at a folder which is not, a number is not leaping out to me quite yet, but I suspect it might. But I'll write to the committee about the numbers. But the levels, you know, were, I think in my opening remarks, if I can perhaps find that. Yeah, we're at, in the week ending 7th of March, 56,000 staff took tests and 12,000 pupils took tests. So the level of staff participation is extraordinary and really welcome. And the pupil numbers are very encouraging, but obviously we'll have more of that in the weeks to come as more pupils are back in school. But and also by all the accounts that I hear, the logistical arrangements of distributing all of the testing kits to 2,500 schools around the country has been, with the exception of snowfall, pretty straightforward.
Excellent, thanks very much.
Can I ask that you ask a line of questions as one question, if possible, please, in fairness to the members? But if we don't get everything covered, I will bring you in at the end as well.
Entirely appreciate that, yes. So as one perhaps slightly elongated question, Cabinet Secretary, we had the Children and Young Persons Commissioner in with the committee recently, who when asked to describe how his office had been able to engage with the SQA over the issue of the alternative assessment model, he described it as being very challenging and said that there's still a long way to go for his office to essentially be satisfied that the SQA are meeting their requirements to respect children and young people's rights. Are you concerned by those comments, and how? What is your level of awareness of engagement between the Commissioner's office and the SQA?
I think there's, I suppose there's two dimensions to this question. The first is the engagement of the SQA with young people in the determination of the policy and practical approaches that the SQA takes forward. And in that respect, well, first of all, that's essential. And secondly, and if it wasn't essential before a week past Tuesday, it's very, very essential after a week past Tuesday, because we incorporated the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scots law, primarily to drive a culture within Scotland where we are attentive to and adhering to the respecting of children's and young people's rights. And in that respect, I think the SQA are doing a lot of good work to engage young people and have established a young learners forum and panel which enables them to engage on these questions. So that is fundamental, and I'm satisfied that the SQA are doing that, and obviously I'm keen to make sure that that is sustained in the period going forward. That is the purpose of the whole approach on many of these questions, and particularly about incorporation of UNCRC. In relation to the engagement with the Children and Young People's Commissioner, well, the Commissioner will speak for himself about whether the engagement is satisfactory. I would want the SQA to engage constructively with the Children and Young People's Commissioner. The government engages constructively with the Children and Young People's Commissioner. I often think that we do everything that is asked of us, and that we do things as we should do them, but sometimes that attracts criticism from the Commissioner, and that is his right and his role, and the SQA may find themselves in a relatively similar position. But I would encourage strong and close cooperation to enable the Commissioner to form a view about the steps that have been taken by the SQA on these important issues.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I move to questions from Ms Wishart, please?
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Can I first of all align myself with the comments that you made in your opening remarks to thank all pupils, parents, teaching and support staff for all that they have done this past year, and I'd also like to recognise that teachers are working parents too. Can I ask about the OECD interim report? In evidence to this committee and in response to one of my questions, Cabinet Secretary, you confirmed that you'd discussed the interim report with the OECD. Our FOI requests show that never happened, and I asked about this last week, so I wonder if you could confirm why you chose not to take forward that conversation, and what contact has the Scottish Government had with OECD since it received the draft report?
Well, there's obviously there's an ongoing dialogue with the OECD about the report, and I think I've confirmed in parliamentary answers that I've discussed. The OECD have raised issues with me and asked for my opinions about certain questions that they are looking at and my impressions and reflections on wider questions around the issues that are at the heart of the OECD review. So, but that's been about substantive educational questions. I think the key point here is that the OECD are going through a process that the government has commissioned them to do in response to some of the choices that we've made and some of the choices that Parliament has asked us to make and the committee has asked us to make. And the OECD are pursuing that that agenda, and obviously they've undertaken some recent stakeholder engagement which enables them to then proceed to finalise the report, which we expect to receive in June.
Thank you. Do you expect to meet with the Practitioner Forum to discuss the report over the coming weeks?
Not me, no, I won't be, no.
Okay. Can I move on to additional teachers? The extra teachers employed through the emergency funding are obviously providing much needed support at the moment. So can schools rely on this extra support beyond the end of the school year? And should those staff expect to have the same job in the next school year?
There certainly is. I think we get into some of this tricky territory about the fact that I'm not the employer, but in general, I think there's no reason why that shouldn't be the case, because the funding for the additional teachers has been provided for school year 2021 and school year 21-22. So there is, in my opinion, no reason why teachers that have been part of the additional cohort taken on, or any additional cohort taken on in this context around COVID, should face any uncertainty about their position, because the finances available for local authorities to enable that continuity of employment to be offered.
And finally, can I ask about school counsellors? Do you have a figure for the number of new school counsellors recruited, further to the commitment the government made?
I don't think I have a precise number in my head. I'll probably have to write to the committee about that point. But I think, from my recollection of parliamentary answers, the commitment to this programme of employment has been completed, and we are satisfied with the information that has come back from local authorities about their recruitment. And obviously, we're in slightly different circumstances because schools have not been back full time, but the local authorities have engaged very constructively in this programme, and we have, and I understand that commitment has been fulfilled. But I better write to the committee to clarify the precise details of that.
Thank you. That would be appreciated. I mean, I think we understand that the school counsellors were needed before the pandemic, and they'll be needed even more so going forward. Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
If I could add briefly, Convener, in relation to the latter point that Beatrice Wishart has made there, I unreservedly accept that point, that the necessity for school counsellors is ever greater as a consequence of the pandemic, and a lot of the approach that we've taken in relation to the return of secondary pupils particularly has been about trying to address some of those anxieties and worries about well-being, which I know will lie at the heart of the question that Beatrice Wishart has put to me this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you. I still have 3 members who haven't asked initial questions, but I'm also conscious Mr. Green has to go. Mr. Green, if you can roll your question into everything into one question for the Cabinet Secretary, I'm happy for you to come in at the moment.
Thank you for that. I do appreciate that, Convener, and apologies to other members for jumping the queue. Cabinet Secretary, I just wanted to push on the issue of, I know you mentioned briefly with Daniel Johnson the issue of catch-up, but I wondered if you had any comment on the attainment gap. Obviously, you'll be aware of comments yesterday by the Auditor General of Scotland, the Auditor General for Scotland, who said that the pace of improvement by the Scottish Government has to increase if the attainment gap is not going to widen further. And you'll probably be aware of comments made by the Commission for School Reform, who argued for additional teaching time to catch up learning. They produced a paper which I thought had some very interesting ideas and suggestions in there about how individual schools could make use of teaching resource for catch-up lessons And wrapped into that, I guess, is the issue of supply teachers. I spoke to one yesterday who said they've been out of work since last August. Given the focus on attainment, surely we should be getting resource from every and all source possible. What commitments can be made in that respect?
Right, well, there's certainly a few topics in here, Convener. Let me start first of all with the Audit Scotland report, and I thought the Audit Scotland report was a pretty fair read, to be honest. I think the report highlights that progress has been made in closing the poverty-related attainment gap, and the report marshalled the fact that in the overwhelming majority of local authority areas, progress had been made around the indicators that the report focused upon. Obviously, the indicators that the report looks at are slightly different to the indicators that the government looks at in the National Improvement Framework, about which we consulted extensively. But I think on the whole, I think it's a pretty fair assessment of the situation. And I accept that, but we've always accepted that the closure of the gap will be a long-term endeavour. We never said it would be done within 5 years. We said it would take at least 2 parliamentary terms, and we will continue that work if the government is re-elected to sustain that agenda, because it is crucial to the life chances of children and young people. So I think the report accurately charts the progress that's been made, and we'll want to make progress and intensify that in the period going forward. The report also fairly says that it's likely that the pandemic has inserted further challenges into the education system, and we must address them with the recovery agenda that I've talked about. In relation to the question about catch-up, and I welcome the opportunity to air this a little bit more beyond what I said to Daniel Johnson. I think there's a pretty, I think there needs to be quite a discussion about the concept of catch-up, and I know this was pursued by the Commission on School Reform in relation to additional teaching time. Like many things in education, I could marshal opinions that would take a very different view to that would actually set out in pedagogical and educational terms that increased class contact time beyond what young people are already experiencing could well be counterproductive to the educational journey of young people. So I think there is a substantive educational debate to be had here about what is the correct approach, because I come back to part of my answer to Daniel Johnson. Young people will have learned more and acquired greater skills during the period of lockdown as a consequence of what they've had to do to adapt to those circumstances. So I would be keen for us to have an open educational debate, because when we've discussed this in the Education Recovery Group, I have to say there has not been a strong argument in favour of the type of proposals that the Commission on School Reform were putting forward. Now, that's not me dismissing them. I'm saying there's different opinions that we need to focus on, and my core early priority is to get schools back as quickly as I can and back into a normal way of operation. And then for teachers to be able to assess what are the challenges that individual young people face as a consequence of the disruption that they have faced. So those are the points of debate that I think we've got to look at as part of that process. Now, lastly, on supply teachers, I'm sorry that Mr. Green has had that representation from a supply teacher, because I literally can't quite fathom why supply teachers have not got posts just now. And it comes back to, again, part of what I said in my response to Beatrice Wishart, that I'm not the employer of the teachers, but I have put a lot of money into the system, which I think should provide enough opportunities for supply teachers to be fully occupied. Indeed, some directors of education are saying to me they could do with more supply teachers, but in their locality they quite simply can't access them because they're using all the supply teachers that they have available. So I think there may well be differential problems around the country where you have in some areas circumstances where individuals cannot secure employment because there are too many supply teachers available, and in other parts of the country there may not be enough supply teachers. But I'm very happy to engage further about this issue because, as I say, I can't really see any good reason why supply teachers would not be fully occupied, given the fact that we've put so much money into expanding provision within the education system today.
Thank you. Thank you. Can we move to questions from Mr. Gray, please?
Thank you very much, Convener. I'd like to ask about the Education Recovery Group, which Cabinet Secretary has referred to once or twice. In the Audit Scotland report, which was published earlier this week, the Auditor General says this: the CERG, the Education Recovery Group, was not part of the process for all decisions. For example, the Scottish Government's final decision to reopen schools after the summer holidays in August 2020 was not discussed with the Education Recovery Group in advance and represented a significant change in plan with little notice. Now, much more recently, in the last couple of weeks, we had a decision for pupils in S1 to 3 to return to school partially at this time, and both EIS and School Leaders Scotland, both members of the CERG, said that that was also a decision which was not discussed with the recovery group. So why are these critical decisions, why were they made without discussion with the recovery group?
I think I would take issue with the suggestion that there had been no discussion of these issues with the Education Recovery Group. My view of these issues is that there would be, and from my recollection, I stand to be corrected, but to the best of my recollection, various options would be discussed. For example, the recent step that was taken to return all secondary pupils on a limited basis was aired with the Education Recovery Group, but I certainly would accept it wasn't agreed by the Education Recovery Group, because ultimately ministers have got to take decisions that they consider to be appropriate based on the wider discussion that we take forward. Because one of the challenges that we have is that there will not be unanimity in the Education Recovery Group on all questions, and in that respect, well, somebody has to take a decision, and what often happens is we'll air these issues, we'll hear people's views, and then we get to that moment where we have to consider what's happening next, and it essentially falls on my shoulders to say, well, the Cabinet will consider these questions. So it's about hearing people's perspectives. I listen carefully to the different views, but I don't think anyone would expect the Education Recovery Group to be able to take decisions that the Cabinet is properly required to take and accountable for to Parliament through the normal lines of political accountability.
Well, the Cabinet Secretary says he stands to be corrected. He's already been corrected by the Auditor General, by the EIS and by SLS. They don't say these decisions were not agreed by the Education Recovery Group. They all say they were not discussed by the Education Recovery Group. So what confidence can we have, what assurances can the Cabinet Secretary give us then that the full-time return to school after the Easter holidays has been properly discussed and, if possible, agreed by the Education Recovery Group? They say not discussed. They don't say not agreed. They say not discussed.
Well, I quite simply have to, disagree with the points of view of the Auditor General and the EIS and School Leaders Scotland. I think these issues are aired. I accept they're not finalised, agreed. I know the EIS.
Why would they make that up? I don't understand why they would make that up. Why would the Auditor General make that up?
Well, and from my recollection, I stand to be corrected. I'll go away and I'll check the record and I'll write to the committee about it. But from, my view of these discussions is that these issues would be aired with the Education Recovery Group and would air them and would listen to people's views. And then ultimately I would feed back the views to Cabinet and the Cabinet would take decisions. Now, I'll go away and check all the records about that point. But, from, having that issue put to me this morning, my sense is that these points do get aired there, but they might not get finally decided there. and that would be the way I would characterise it. But I'll go and check it, and if there's an issue, I'll write to the committee about that.
And
in terms of the return after Easter, well, obviously, the Education Recovery Group has already discussed some of these questions already, and we will be meeting again tomorrow. We're going to meet, despite the fact that Parliament's not sitting. The Education Recovery Group is going to continue to meet on a weekly basis, and I will continue to chair all of its meetings. I might not chair its meeting on May the 6th. I may bring it forward a day, since I might have other matters on my mind that day. But it will be the Education Recovery Group will be continued to be engaged on all these questions.
I could chair it. I'm free that day.
Well, I'm sure. I'm sure, even despite Mr. Gray's relaxation, I can't imagine he'll be able to extricate himself from being busy on the 6th of May. But he may surprise me in that respect.
Mr. Gray, is that you finished with questions?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you. Can we move to Mr. Mundell, please?
Thank you, Convener. I wanted just to come up back on some of the comments around catch-up. I mean, I'm willing to accept it's not just as straightforward, as some people would argue, but I also struggle to accept that the last year has been good for a lot of young people. Yes, there are some who will have benefited and picked up additional experiences from outside the classroom and who will have done well with remote learning, but it's also clear that there are a group of young people who have really struggled in the last year, and I repeatedly have parents raise concerns with me, and it's just whether the Cabinet Secretary can give any sort of assurance that there will be a kind of individual assessment for each young person, whether or not they would require any additional support as a result of the disruption to their learning.
Convener, the first thing I'd want to say is I want to reassure Mr. Mundell that I'm not in any way dismissing this issue. I totally acknowledge the point that he is raising about the experiences of young people. I can't for a moment say that I think the school year 2020-21 has been ideal. It has been very disruptive for young people and families. So I acknowledge that disruption. I think what I'm keen to have, and I suppose it is probably contained actually in the question that Mr. Mundell has raised with me, is that I want the education system to engage with young people and with families to establish what needs to be done on an individual basis to support young people in the fulfilment of their educational potential. Now, for some young people, that may require additional intervention, and schools will be able to plan how best that can be done. That may involve rebalancing elements of the curriculum, for example, for individual young people. And again, the recruitment of additional staffing resources will be crucial to enabling that to happen, so that young people may, for example, individual young people may have a need to have greater intervention in terms of their acquisition of literacy skills rather than numeracy skills or whatever else happens to be the case. There is obviously also the provision available through the National e-Learning Offer, where schools can point young people and support them in accessing additional learning opportunities that are now readily available across a whole range of senior phase subjects and also the broad general education, which can act as a focal point for additional learning opportunities. And then there are also some of the tutoring and mentoring opportunities that are available. And I should add also to that, of course, that most schools will be operating during the Easter break some additional facilities, as they would normally do for senior phase candidates, to prepare them for certification. So I think what I would want to reassure Mr. Mundell about is that I'm very open to a discussion about what this would look like and what it should feel like. And obviously there are some educational recovery resources that the government hasn't yet allocated that could well be allocated to such a purpose. And if I go back to the question that Beatrice Wishart raised with me about supply teachers, you know, there's other resources that we could well allocate that could be used in such an area. But I think we need to have quite an open discussion about what that looks like and what that feels like, rather than, you know, if I could characterise it by saying everybody's got to stay in school for an extra hour every night or something like that, because educationally and in pedagogical terms, the advice available to me is that that would not be a productive intervention.
No, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. I think it's not, you know, I agree, it's not just about the classroom. You know, I'm concerned for young people, particularly in rural communities, who've missed out on a number of experiences, particularly, you know, those at the end of primary school who would have enjoyed going on residential trips and doing other bits and pieces. I just feel, you know, for those young people, you know, socialisation is as important as other learning, and you know, there is a recognition that's been missed. But in terms of additional resources, it's coming back to a question I've asked several times over the years on this committee and in the chamber. I'm still very concerned, you know, with lots of additional money going into the system, that we have this 3%, I think it now is, of schools who still don't get any pupil equity funding. You know, and I do feel when it comes to balancing some of these decisions, you know, around how we best support individuals, the fact that head teachers in those often smaller schools, many of which are largely rural, you don't have the same discretion to support young people. And I would just ask the Cabinet Secretary if it's something he's given any further thought to.
Yeah, can I say one thing just about the earlier question that Mr Mundell raised with me? I completely accept the point that young people, certain cohorts, have really missed out in the last year. You know, rites of passage moments for lots of young people, of trips that every school goes to every year that have not happened. These are very painful losses for children and young people, and I know that acutely. So I think but then I know that members will appreciate that we just can't delve into residential trips just now, unfortunately. Much as though I would love to enable that to be the case, we just can't do it with the pandemic. But as soon as it is safe to do so, we will enable that to be the case. In relation to Mr Mundell has been has argued consistently on the point around the distribution of pupil equity funding and the fact that it doesn't reach 100% of schools. I suppose my answer, you know, I've looked at this in two ways. One is that I suppose the fundamental point, which is the purpose of pupil equity funding, which is to target it towards the measures required to close the poverty-related attainment gap. So therefore there has to be fundamentally a measure of poverty to determine where that should be distributed. That then brings into the second point, which is really, I think, the point that Mr Mundell has pursued me on for some time, which is the current distribution mechanism doing that, and doing it effectively and comprehensively? And I suppose my answer to that is that it's doing it as comprehensively as I can find a measure to do it so far, and I've not been able to find a measure that enables me to go any further or to stretch the reach of it any further. The point that Mr Mundell raises is, of course, I think probably always going to be the case amongst small rural schools where it is difficult to identify instances of poverty. And I think the measures that we have capture a lot of that. They may not capture all of it. And I have undertaken work. We've not managed to get to a better mechanism to distribute it beyond what we have just now, but I certainly remain committed to exploring whether that is possible to do so.
Just a very final small question. Would the Cabinet Secretary consider, with further money that's to be allocated for COVID recovery, taking rurality into account, you know, as a factor in and of itself? Because I think those young people have missed out, in a sense, in terms of that social aspect, far more, you know, where they don't have other young people living, you know, in close proximity, you know, to where they live, and you know, they've had limited social opportunities in the last year.
We have actually, in the distribution arrangements for COVID recovery finance, so not pupil equity funding or Scottish Attainment Challenge, but COVID recovery, in a number of those funding streams, we have actually increased the accent on rurality as a factor in the distribution formula through our dialogue with the Settlement and Distribution Group, who advise COSLA on these questions. So the factors of rurality have had a greater influence in the distribution of COVID recovery monies than they would ordinarily have in other circumstances. And I will continue to apply that in the period going forward.
Thank you. Can we move to please? Ms. Mackay? Yeah. I think Rona's on mute. Right, that's you now, Rona. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I wanted to ask about the distribution of devices. There seems to be quite a difference between local authorities, and I know local authorities were funded for that purpose. I wonder if this is how this is being addressed, and particularly with a view to, perhaps using them the medium to long term in the future, because some areas do seem to be missing out.
Yeah, we've taken. There's been essentially probably three elements to the funding approach on devices. The starting point of it all, of course, was the gathering of data from local authorities, and we asked local authorities to give us their best estimates of the gaps in the availability of digital devices. The first tranche of that involved the distribution of 25,000 devices that the government, we just went ahead and bought 25,000 devices early in the pandemic, so we would have them available to us. And we distributed them to local authorities based on some of the need that was expressed. We then balanced that with a distribution of cash sums to local authorities, because for some local authorities, they already had extensive provision of devices in place for students. And then the third tranche was making available financial flexibility around a sum of £45 million, which enabled schools and local authorities to choose how they would distribute, how they would use money to fill some of the digital gaps. Now, in amongst all of this, I'm confident that in excess of 70,000 students have been supported with devices and connectivity packages. But I think the pandemic has exposed the fact that we need to have a more comprehensive solution in place to the availability of devices for learning purposes. So some local authorities, if you take the Scottish Borders Council, for example, Scottish Borders Council distribute devices to all pupils, all learners. And that's a policy decision they've taken as a council. I think actually it's a really great decision, and I'm glad they took it in advance of the pandemic. But not all authorities operate on that basis. And I certainly think there's a need for wider progress to be made on this question, because to me, digital devices and connectivity are, frankly, if I show my age here, the jotters of the 21st century.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Can I bring in Mr. Adam, please?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I would just like to ask Cabinet Secretary, we've had an unprecedented year. Unlike any other year, these young people and teachers and those involved in education have had to deal with that. But probably much like yourself, Cabinet Secretary, I'm a great one for seeing a challenge and seeing a way of trying to make things work. And when I was looking at some of the submissions given to us by the local authorities, and being quite parochial, you'll be surprised, I went straight to Renfrewshire Council. And Renfrewshire Council's submissions and ideas to us was they initially did an audit to see what the pandemic had done to the attainment with pupils. They checked the findings and made sure that they were going to work towards actually putting the resource in. Now, surely to me this looks like a local authority, and like other local authorities, that are just getting the data, and even though it's challenges like no other, they're trying to find a positive way forward. And surely rather than, I know we've got to make sure we go through everything in this committee, but rather than just allowing that dark cloud of despair to go all over us, it's a case of getting the sleeves up and getting on with the job.
I think there's a fair amount of pragmatism in Mr. Adams' perspective here, as always. I think my sense of the experience, the last year has been really disruptive, and none of us would have wanted it to be the case. But I have to say the education system has absolutely run at this problem and run at it at a fast pace. Despite the worries and the anxieties, staff generally want to be back in school. They might be anxious, and they are right to be anxious, but they also want to be back in school. The provision of remote learning since January, I think, has been absolutely first class. I think staff have used the preparatory period since the lockdown in March last year, the return to school in August, and they've produced a lot of really good stuff. And the remote learning offer has been high quality for children and young people around the country. So I think to look at Renfrewshire, Renfrewshire Council has got a very strong track record in evidence-based policy making, collecting the data. They've run, in partnership with the University of Strathclyde, some really outstanding literacy programmes involving Professor Sue Ellis at Strathclyde University, which has really transformed the approach to literacy. And I actually visited a primary school in Renfrewshire Council who had won a United Kingdom award for their application of a literacy programme. I don't think it was in Mr. Adams' constituency, because I'm sure I would have heard about it. I'm sure Mr. Adam would have been there if it wasn't his constituency. But it was it arose out of a very strongly evidenced research programme about acquisition of literacy skills, in which Renfrewshire Council had been prepared to change practice. And I think this is commendable, where they were prepared to change practice, do things differently, because evidence told them there was a better approach for children to acquire literacy skills. And that's what education is all about. It's about researching, challenging our existing practice, and being prepared to do things differently if it's in the interest of children and young people.
Thank you. Mr. Adam, is that you, Content?
No, thank you, Convener. Thanks.
Thank you. Can I bring back in Mr. Johnson, and can Mr. Greer indicate if he still has an additional question in the chat? Thanks.
Convener, I don't have an additional question.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Mr. Greer?
Thank you, Convener. To return to my previous line of questioning about the Children and Young Persons Commissioner and the SQA, I'd like to ask the Cabinet Secretary a little bit about the appeals process. I know you're familiar with the question, the issues raised by the Commissioner about young people's ability to directly access appeals. There's an SQA consultation ongoing at that at the moment. It's a very short consultation. I think it's 2 weeks, closes this Friday. Is your understanding of that process at the moment that it's a question of how young people can directly access appeals, or is it still a question of whether or not that's appropriate at all?
I think it's quite difficult for me to give a definitive answer to that question today, because the consultation has not reached its conclusions. But the way I suppose I can answer it is that what the SQA have assured me about is that they are proceeding in the consultation on a basis that would satisfy the requirements of the provisions of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which I think would require the considerations that lie at the heart of Mr. Greer's question. No, I don't think they would require the considerations that lie at the heart of Mr. Greer's question to be taken into account. By what mechanism, I would have to wait to see the outcome of the consultation and the proposals that emerge from that.
Thank you. And just one brief final question. I'm going to interpret that as a reassuring answer. So one brief final question. S6 pupils or school leavers usually finish school either late April or into early May. That's the end of their time at school. They then do exams during exam leave. They don't come back afterwards. given the unique circumstances this year, is it your expectation that most S6 pupils or school leavers of 4, 5 or 6 will be in school until the end of June to ensure that they've completed the work required for the alternative assessment model?
I'm not sure what's motivating Mr Greer's question here as to whether he has some S4, S5 or S6 people in mind that he needs to have a definitive piece of guidance issued to. But that would be my expectation, because what the SQ have done, or the National Qualifications Group have done, is delayed the moment for the collection of estimated grades to the very last possible moment of the 25th of June to maximise the time available for learning and teaching. Because one of the points that we have to be absolutely confident about in the alternative certification model is that all of the learning and teaching that requires to be done to merit certification has in fact been done by the time certification takes place. So because of the disruption, although schools have done very well in the provision of remote learning, and the national e-learning offer, I think, has substantially helped in the delivery of learning and teaching, we have to make sure there is adequate opportunity for that learning and teaching to be accomplished. So I would expect that to be still ongoing within schools much later in the school year than would ordinarily be the case.
Thank you.
Thank you. If I could ask, I think Mr Gray wants to come back in at the last moment. Sorry, Mr Gray.
Apologies, it is really a follow-up from Ross Gear's line of questioning. I think in your introductory remarks, Cabinet Secretary, you said that you believed the alternative certification model wouldn't pose a significant additional burden on schools, but I think we've all seen, if only anecdotally, teachers saying that actually the model which has been pursued is imposing an enormous burden, or will impose an enormous burden on them between now and June in order to complete courses, complete and mark the assessments and make the required assessments of the SQA. So I just wonder, you said you've spoken to 1,000 teachers in the past couple of weeks. Did none of them feel that a burden was being placed on them by the alternative model developed by the SQA?
I think, well, the first thing I'd say is that the alternative certification model has been developed, as Professor Priestley encouraged us to do so, as a system-wide collaboration. It has been led by the SQA, yes, but it has involved local authorities, directors of education, professional associations and Colleges Scotland in the formulation of that model. So a very deliberate change of approach was taken to ensure that there was system-wide dialogue around the development of the alternative certification model, and it's been developed on that basis. I think I acknowledge that there are workload implications for members of staff. I've obviously taken some account of that by the additional payment that has been made to staff who are involved in this process, which I announced some time ago. But I think what also has happened is that we've tried to streamline some of the requirements that are placed on schools, whether that's in terms of the materials that have got to be provided, and then also by providing to schools assessment items that can be undertaken within schools, which save schools developing what would be evidence of the performance of young people. So we've tried to structure that in a way that does not add to the workload of schools. And obviously we'll monitor that carefully and determine whether that has been successful over the course of the alternative certification model, and we'll reflect on that in the light of the experience that we have.
Thank you. If I could ask a final question, Cabinet Secretary. I think anxiety and concern is something that's been repeated over and over again in our committee meetings with regards to where young people are feeling and where parents and carers are feeling about what's happened. And that exists whether it's nursery to primary transition, primary to secondary, or pupils sitting their certification models in the last year and this year, but also for our students in further and higher education as well. Every one of them has had a unique experience that none of us would ever have wanted to happen. But I think it's really important to remind everyone that they're not unique in this, that this has been a world pandemic. Every country has had to be dealing with these concerns, and schools been closed and everything else that's gone on. So I wonder, just in the future, to look back on what's happened for this whole cohort of students and pupils that have been affected, how we can compare that internationally to ensure that what we're putting in the longer term in terms of helping some of the emotional and some of the stress issues that have been felt, but also all that element of catch up and missing out on practical experiences. How can we benchmark that with what's happening in the rest of the world and ensure that Scotland's meeting the requirements going forward?
I think it's a very important issue, Kavina. We look closely at international evidence, and obviously I benefit significantly from the contribution of the International Council of Education Advisors to bring a very broad international perspective around numerous jurisdictions to the work that we undertake here in Scotland. And at various stages during the pandemic, I have consulted the International Council, and they've given me the familiar level of high quality advice that I always receive from them. In addition to that, I think we've got to focus very clearly on making sure that we achieve the expectations that we want to achieve within Scottish education, and that involves, and I think that's the mood that I pick up from within the education system. Educators are desperate to get on with making sure young people are able to fulfil their potential. That's what gets them out of their bed in the morning, and I think that sense of impetus is really important within the education system. I think you started your question, Kavina, by asking me about within the further and higher education sector, and we are, the First Minister announced last week some steps to enable more college students to return, because we are we're desperate to make sure that college students are able to make as much progress during this year. Some of the college-based courses, of course, are intensely practically delivered courses, and that is an anxiety to many learners. I know it's a big anxiety to lecturers about the importance of getting students into colleges. We're trying to make sure as much of that as possible and to provide reassurance to those who find that more challenging at this time.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I think that completes questions this morning. Can I thank you once again for your attendance at committee this morning? And I know you're going to leave the meeting now, but I'll move on with the further agenda items. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is the final meeting of the Education and Skills Committee in Session 5 of the Parliament. And can I take this opportunity to thank all individuals, including many teachers, parents, carers and young people, and organisations who have engaged with the committee over the last 5 years. Their input has been invaluable to our work since 2016, and it is greatly appreciated. Two of our members, Ian Gray and Alec Neil, are standing down at the end of this election, so I would like to take an opportunity to thank them for their contribution to this committee and to the Parliament as a whole in their time as MSPs. They have made a huge contribution to politics in Scotland. I'd also like to thank the other members of the committee, past and present, and wish everyone well going forward. And finally, I'd like to thank our clerks and Spice and the support staff of the Parliament who have supported the committee throughout the session since 2016. We will now move into private session, and I thank all members for attendance this morning.